Hello and welcome. This is video number one in a two-part series about totalitarianism, and we'll take a look at it in the context of Soviet Russia, and in particular with the leader Joseph Stalin. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so first of all, I just want to speak a little bit generally about totalitarianism itself to try to describe what totalitarianism is and why it began to develop when it did. So first of all, basically going with the definition for totalitarianism describes a government that takes total centralized state control over every aspect of both public and private life. So there's no distinction between what might go on in your own private home and what might take place out in the community. And basically, the goal with totalitarianism is to erase any kind of distinction or line between government and society, essentially making it one and the same. And so, as I said before, we're going to take a look at the Soviet Union as an example, as a place where totalitarianism developed and took place. And within the Soviet Union, in the time period that we're talking about, and this will really begin, especially with Joseph Stalin in the late 20s and moving forward. During this time, people were simply expected to approve of and agree with everything that their government did. And they were expected especially to follow their leader, whether it was Stalin initially, or it would also be true with some of the later leaders as well, and also to follow a single political party, which would be the Communist Party in the Soviet Union during the time period that we're talking about. Now, the idea of a government being in control or an individual being in control is not a new concept for things that we've looked at and talked about. I mean, for example, the Russian czars were autocrats, especially the ones in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and they ruled with total power. So the idea of trying to have total power is not new, but with totalitarianism, what takes it to a different level, kind of a higher level of control, is the use of technology. Getting into the 1920s and moving forward, the ability to mass communicate with people was beginning to become more available, and just the capacity or capability of a government to track what was happening within the society was getting more refined and simply more possible. So just the capability to really control the society through and through only really began to take shape as the technologies advanced enough to give the government the tools to do that. Something else that we'll also see as consistent with totalitarianism, and it's certainly true with the Soviet Union example we'll look at, is that violence really is ever present as a way of discouraging people who disagree with the government. That basically you can be frightened into supporting the government with totalitarianism. Now, one of the things I want to get to in this video is just to talk a little bit about Stalin himself, and then we'll talk about some of the other characteristics of totalitarianism and how it works. First of all, just a little bit on Stalin. He was a former Bolshevik, so when the Bolshevik Revolution took place that led into the Soviet Union forming, he was an important figure in that process. And as far as his position within that hierarchy or within that system, he was really a top-level guy, somewhat close to Lenin. And by the time Lenin died, he had risen to the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. And one of the things he was able to do, and this would really serve him well for the next several decades, is that at that time and moving forward, he got people into positions of importance around him that were supportive of him. Because one thing that's true from the beginning, there were certainly people who didn't like Stalin and were concerned about him being in a leadership role. So one of the ways he solidified his position of power is to make sure any ways that he could, he put people that were going to support him around him. Now, as far as leadership in the Soviet Union, Lenin was the first leader with the Soviet Union, but they had no plan for what to do when Lenin died. So Lenin would die in 1924, and this is where Stalin basically takes advantage of the situation where they didn't have a succession plan. And so he would not only gain control of the Communist Party itself, but gain control of the Soviet Union overall. And this is when we really begin to see this concept of totalitarianism play out, because he'll basically use the methods and the practices of totalitarianism to really bring his vision for the country alive. I also want to point out, really try to pay attention as we go through today's video, as well as the second in the series, to the propaganda posters that are a part of a lot of these slides, because a big part of the success that Stalin was able to have was, despite the fact that there were some pretty rough things that took place while he was in power, he did a really good job of making sure there was no connection between an objectively bad thing that people were experiencing and him having anything to do with it. So even in the most awful of circumstances, people generally were supportive of Stalin because they didn't associate hard times that they experienced with him, that it was some other factor that was leading to trouble for them. For example, you look at the picture on there, when you translate it out, it says, "Long live the victorious nation, long live our dear Stalin." So that was an example of some of the things people would have seen. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on in this first video with totalitarianism is just to talk through some of the methods or techniques that were used to make a system like this work. And one of the things, again, look, here's another propaganda poster, Stalin holding up a young child. And when you translate what it says there, it says, "Stalin's kindness enlightens the future of our children." So if you look at that and believe that, it's hard not to think this is a pretty great guy. And so that kind of speaks to one of the elements that's listed up here. If you look along the bottom of the slide, it says propaganda, indoctrination, terror, and censorship. So I want to talk about each of those a little bit at a time. So with propaganda, propaganda itself is just simply biased or incomplete information that's designed to persuade people to believe something. It's not necessarily a negative thing or inherently bad. I mean, if you just think about advertising, commercials that are on TV, I mean, that's effectively propaganda that the manufacturer of some kind of product that they're trying to sell is putting out there to try to persuade you to buy their product. So we experience propaganda all the time in various forms. Now, in a totalitarian state, all the forms of media that are used, like television that might put out a commercial, or a radio that might put out information, has to put forward a common message. And so under Stalin in the Soviet Union, newspapers, movies, radio, all of those were controlled by the state. And as far as individual creativity was concerned, or an individual message, if it didn't promote the views of Stalin and the Communist Party, it wasn't allowed to be out there. Even art, for example, like paintings and sculptures, that kind of thing, the only thing that was supposed to be about was glorifying the Communist Party, glorifying the state, glorifying the heroic worker. So when it came to like images that people would see, or information that they would get, all of it was geared towards promoting Stalin and promoting the state. Anything else just simply wasn't allowed. And then this kind of plays into the idea of indoctrination. Basically, with indoctrination, what it's about is getting people to believe, and in this case, what the government wants them to believe. And again, that's not necessarily a unique thing to a totalitarian regime. Any kind of instructional program is trying to get you to believe things. I guess the difference is how many different things are available for people to try to get you to believe things. And in the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, it was all about promoting the state and all about the things he wanted you to believe. And in the Soviet Union, schools were used for this significantly. Young people in a society are much more easily influenced than older people in a society. Younger people are still trying to figure out what they believe and how they understand things. And so Stalin and places like this will take advantage of young people to give them a message. That's what they grow up with. That's all they know. So they have no reason to believe differently. And then terror is another big part of how totalitarianism works, and certainly was true under Stalin in the Soviet Union. And that's basically just using whatever means, whatever violence, whatever means necessary to crush the people that might oppose the state or are believed to be in opposition to the state. And so police and police type units were used to try to enforce government policies and basically keep people in line with what the government wanted them to be doing. And this included things like spying on people, intimidating people, using any kinds of force all the way up to murder to get people in line. And really just the threat of those things often would work to keep people in line, or at least keep them silent. And when you look at the time that Stalin was in power, when it was all said and done, ultimately millions of people, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video, ultimately millions of people ended up being killed in some way or another while he was in power. But again, I just want to emphasize that through the use of propaganda and some of these techniques, even though killings were taking place, even though there were times where there were food shortages or other problems that were really devastating to people, the way the information was put out, people did not associate those negative things with Stalin, that they associated him with something else altogether. And that in the minds of many, even in the midst of suffering and real struggle, they saw Stalin as this leader that was really out for their good and was all about trying to help them. So it's very strange how these kinds of systems can work. So I think I'd like to leave it here in this video for today. And in the next video in the series, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the Soviet Union under Stalin using the techniques of totalitarianism. Hopefully you found this video helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.